There was something wrong with the way the corpses smiled. That's what the sheriff whispered before he vanished in the swamps of Iberia Parish. He said it once, just once, and never again. But those 5 words were enough. Enough to open an unsealed box, one hidden behind stained glass, polite silence, and the scent of funeral lilies rotting in the heat. Louisiana, 1891. In a state known for its ghosts, one family found a way to profit from them. The Duval family didn't just bury the dead, they prepared them, they spoke to them, and if rumors are true, they may have even created them. Their funeral home, nestled in the damp outskirts of a town long swallowed by moss and memory, was not a place of rest. It was a stage, a theater of corpses, a place where death became currency, and the living were little more than unpaid actors. They called it Maison de la Paix, House of Peace, but that's not what the locals called it. They had another name. La Chambre Menteuse, the lying room, because everything inside it was false. The tears, the prayers, the deaths, even the coffins. You see, the Duvals were not just morticians, they were alchemists of perception, twisting illness into opportunity, grief into obedience, and fear into silence. What you're about to hear isn't simply a horror story, it's a blueprint, a revelation of how trust is weaponized, how institutions mask ancient appetites, and how families, when given too much privacy and too much power, become something else entirely. And when the truth finally began to surface, the officials who uncovered it tried to bury it again, because what was found beneath that funeral home didn't just defy law, it defied God. This isn't just about a family that killed, it's about a ritual system, masked as public service, designed to feed on death itself. You're not just watching this, you're entering it. And once you hear what they did, what they kept doing, you'll never trust the hands that prepare your dead again. Comment: I don't look away from the dark twice if you're ready to see what others were too afraid to face. Now, step inside. The door has already closed behind you. They said the Duvals came from France, but no records were ever found, no ship manifests, no immigration papers, just arrival. The first time anyone remembers seeing them was in the summer of 1863, during the war, when the Mississippi ran red and towns like Ellesmere bled men by the dozen. The Duvals bought the property at the edge of the cypress grove, a crumbling plantation house long abandoned after a slave rebellion. No one else wanted it, but the Duvals. They paid in full, in gold. Within weeks, the transformation began. The house was restored with uncanny speed. Black drapes covered every window. The chimneys never stopped smoking, even in the heat of July. And by the end of the year, a new sign hung from the iron gate: Maison de la Paix, Duval's Sons, Funeral Specialists. The timing was perfect. Soldiers were dying. Fever was rampant. Families needed burials. Quick, discreet, affordable. And the Duvals provided, always available, always efficient, and strangely, always already prepared. You see, that was the first whisper. That the Duvals knew who was going to die before it happened. That they would show up, uninvited, minutes after a death, sometimes hours before. They never explained how, but they always knew. Jacques Duval, the patriarch, was a man of glassy silence. Tall, thin, hair black as burnt cedar. He never blinked when spoken to, never smiled. Locals said he had one blue eye and one gray, and when he looked at you, it felt like someone reading your obituary. His wife Seraphine was the opposite. Sweet voice, soft hands, always bringing candied pecans to grieving widows. But the women of the parish said there was something wrong with her scent, that she smelled not like perfume, but like decay hidden beneath roses. And then there were the children. 3 boys, all pale, all silent. They never went to school, never spoke in public, but every Sunday, they sat perfectly still in the church pews, watching the congregation with blank stares. The priest said they never took communion, only watched others take it. They never spoke a single word. Not even at funerals, especially not at funerals. And yet every funeral they presided over, every body they prepared, was said to look too perfect, too untouched, too preserved, as if death itself had been paused, as if the Duvals didn't serve death, but controlled it. The town of Ellesmere didn't speak against the Duvals, not because they believed in them, but because something deep inside told them it was safer not to. People say evil announces itself with screams, but the truth is more dangerous. It arrives in silence. in the way a door stays unlocked even when you meant to bolt it, in how your breath shortens when someone walks past, though they've said nothing at all. By 1870, the Duvals were burying nearly every corpse in the parish, but the math never made sense. Ellesmere was small, barely 400 people, and yet the Duvals processed 112 bodies in a single year. Some blamed disease, others said it was the aftershocks of war, but there were no outbreaks reported, no epidemics, just a quiet, relentless parade of death. Widows and orphans, drifters, the poor, always the ones no one would miss for long. And yet, when you looked at the faces in the coffins, if you were brave enough to look, you'd notice something else. They were smiling, not naturally, not in peace, but in a stiff, stretched mockery of joy, mouths forced into unnatural shapes, eyes slightly open, pupils rolled back, and in some cases, God help them, teeth removed. The priest finally confronted Jacques Duval one morning after Mass. He asked if the embalming practices were aligned with the dignity of Christian burial. Jacques only replied, "We do not preserve for heaven. We preserve for memory." What does that mean? No one ever found out, because the priest died 3 days later. Accidental drowning, they claimed, though his lungs were dry. After that, even whispers stopped. The sheriff at the time, Malcolm Reeve, allegedly opened an investigation after the body of a child was found buried in a pine box without any family claiming it, but his notes were confiscated, his badge was revoked, and he was sent to Baton Rouge for reassignment. He never came back. The Duvals, it seemed, were untouchable, and their funeral home had grown larger, 3 stories now, more staff, more equipment, even a new wing built behind the main chapel, known only as the holding room. No one was allowed inside, but the smoke never stopped rising from its chimney, even at night. Even when there were no funerals scheduled, they say a town dies in stages. First the church is empty, then the families leave, and finally, the land forgets your name. But Ellesmere didn't die like that. It didn't fade. It rotted. By 1880, something unnatural had settled over the parish. Crops refused to grow. Animals gave birth to stillborn litters. Wells turned foul even when freshly dug. A low hum, inaudible to the ear but felt in the bones, seemed to rise from the ground itself. People started whispering of a burial sickness, not a plague, but a curse. That the dead had become too numerous, too restless, that their bodies, embalmed and unnaturally preserved, were no longer at peace. But the Duvals kept working. In fact, they expanded. They added a second crematorium, though no one ever saw smoke come from its vents. They installed an iron vault beneath the main building, its purpose undisclosed, and they began importing chemicals that bore foreign labels and symbols no one could translate. Glyphs, circles, scripts that looked older than written language. The townsfolk began to change too. Children were born with defects, extra fingers, clouded eyes, skin so pale it nearly shimmered under moonlight. Women miscarried at alarming rates. Men took to drink or vanished into the woods, never to return. It was as if the earth beneath Ellesmere had soured, and it was feeding on its own people. A traveling doctor named Rufus Gray tried to intervene. He documented 38 cases of sudden neurological decline, seizures, memory loss, even hallucinations. His report suggested environmental contamination, possibly mercury, formaldehyde, arsenic, substances used in embalming. But when he requested access to the Duval premises for testing, he was denied. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his boarding house, wrists slashed. The coroner ruled it suicide, but those who saw the body said there were bruises on his neck, bruises shaped like hands. The doctor's notes were confiscated, again, and those who dared ask questions after that were met with visits from the youngest Duval's son, Louisiana, a boy of 16, always dressed in black. He never spoke, just watched, but after he left, people changed. One woman, widowed and childless, was seen days later digging her own grave behind her house. Another man wandered into the swamp with a lantern, muttering about voices in the ash. They found his boots, nothing else. Ellesmere had stopped resisting. The sickness was no longer just in the earth, it was in them. His name was Ellis Bourne. A quiet man, former Union soldier, lived on the edge of town with a limp and a locked trunk full of letters no one had ever read. He didn't drink, didn't pray, didn't speak more than a sentence unless he had to, but when his sister, Lottie, died under the Duval's care, He noticed, because Lottie had never been sick, and 3 days before her death she'd written to him, one sentence, shaky, ink blotted, almost unreadable. "They've begun measuring me." That night after her funeral, Ellis went back. He waited until midnight, armed with a lantern, a crowbar, and a pistol he hadn't used in 15 years. He dug her grave with blistered hands, peeled open the box, and opened her mouth. What he saw made him drop the light. Lottie's tongue was missing, sewn shut with silk thread. Her gums had been stripped of every tooth, her jaw propped into a grin so grotesque it shattered something in his mind. But it wasn't just her face. Pinned beneath her folded hands was a card, embossed, heavy. One word, gilded in red, numero. He burned the body, didn't bury it again, said the ground wasn't clean, and from that day forward, Ellis Bourne became the Duval's shadow. He stopped speaking, started watching, following, sketching, mapping their movements, counting how many bodies went into the chapel, and how few came out. He noticed a pattern. Every 7th funeral was different. No obituary, no mourners, no record in church or town hall. But the Duvals still processed it, still wheeled a covered body into their holding chamber, still lit the chapel candles, still stood in circle formation behind the altar for 17 minutes. Then silence. Always 17, and always on the 7th death. Ellis tried to speak to the town judge, but the man's wife died that same week. Cholera, they said. The judge stopped answering his door, stopped showing on his face. Ellis went further, broke into the funeral home one night. What he found in the cellar wasn't a workspace, it was a temple. Stone floors beneath wooden beams, symbols etched into the walls with bone, shelves of labeled jars filled with teeth, tongues, eyelids, and at the center, a basin, brass, blackened with age, filled with something thick and dark, still warm. There were names carved into the rim, hundreds of them. The last name carved was his sister's, and below it, his numero. Ellis couldn't stop hearing it. It echoed in his head like something whispered through bone, the card he found on Lottie's corpse. He kept it, but no matter where he hid it, buried, burned, drowned, it always reappeared, in his boot, under his pillow, once pinned to his chest while he slept, and each time the ink grew darker, as if it were feeding. Ellis dug into every record he could find, old parish ledgers, French colonial archives, slave manifests, war logs. The word numero wasn't a name, it was a system, a ritual, a count. The Duvals weren't choosing victims randomly, they were offering them, in sequence. Ellis realized each death wasn't just murder, it was calibration, a cycle, a tithe. Every 7th death wasn't a burial, it was a transaction. He traced it back to 1791, Haiti. The Duval name first appeared there during the revolt, but it wasn't a family then. It was a cult, a closed circle of embalmers and physicians who practiced preservation rites stolen from both Vodou and French esoteric traditions. Their goal wasn't healing, it was containment. They believed there was an intelligence buried beneath the veil of death, an ancient order of consciousness trapped between the mortal and the eternal. They called it le témoin, the witness. Not a god, not a demon. Something older, something that watched. They believed that by offering the dying in precise intervals, under strict ceremonial guidelines, they could keep it satisfied. And in doing so, extract secrets from the veil itself, knowledge no living man was meant to hold. It wasn't about control of death, it was about bargaining with it. And the Duvals weren't undertakers, they were intermediaries, generational, indoctrinated, trained not just in embalming, but in ritual, numerology, and necrotic transmission. They weren't feeding bodies to the ground, they were feeding something beneath it. That brass basin in the cellar, Ellis returned and stole from it, a drop of its contents sealed in a flask. He sent it, under false identity, to a university lab in New Orleans. The results came back a week later. Organic matter, unknown origin, blood properties incompatible with human or animal, cellular activity, active, alive. Ellis now understood why Lottie smiled in death, Why the Duvals never aged, why the graves were never left alone at night. The Duvals were not preparing the dead, they were harvesting them. The deeper Ellis went, the more the world around him began to fracture. Mirrors cracked when he passed, dogs howled in his direction, shadows moved where light should have made them still. But the worst sign came from the townspeople, those few who still walked the streets. They began to forget him. Neighbors he'd known for years crossed the road without recognition. The store clerk, who once brought him coffee each morning, looked through him like he wasn't there. The priest stared past him, eyes blank, lips moving in a silent prayer. It was as if the Duvals had reached into reality itself and begun erasing him. But Ellis kept fighting. He broke into the town archives beneath the courthouse and found a sealed ledger, one that didn't exist on any official inventory. It was bound in leather, scrawled with symbols that seemed to crawl when not directly looked at. Inside, names, thousands, dates beside each one, deaths, numbers. Ellis found Lottie's, and then his. Next to his name, July 31st, 1891, 17 days away. The Duvals hadn't just marked him, they had scheduled him. It wasn't superstition, it was a machine, a precise timed structure of death. 17-day gaps, 7 per cycle, each 7th feeding something in the pit below the chapel. But Ellis had one weapon left: knowledge. He returned to the funeral home one last time. This time, through the crypt, an old sunken tunnel sealed during the yellow fever years. It stank of brine and rot and something deeper, metal and incense and blood. At the end of the tunnel was a stone door. Carved into it, the Duval family crest, a serpent biting its own tail. The inscription beneath it read, "À travers la mort, la mémoire se nourrit." Through death, memory feeds. He forced the door open. Inside was a chamber older than the town itself. Walls etched in languages long dead. Bodies, not embalmed, not decayed, preserved, standing in alcoves like sentinels. Their eyes followed him. At the center, a stone altar, and upon it, a book. It opened on its own. The pages flipped to an illustration, a figure cloaked in black robes, arms outstretched, around it 7 coffins, and beneath its feet, the silhouette of a man burning. Ellis knew that silhouette. It was him. He didn't sleep after that. Ellis sat in his house with every door locked, every window boarded, the pistol loaded and trembling in his hand. He'd stared into something ancient, and it had stared back. But the town didn't notice, because the town no longer wanted to notice. Something had changed. Overnight, Elmsmere had become quiet. No dogs, no birds, no sound of church bells or wagons, just wind through empty streets and the constant smell of ash. The Duvals had moved into Phase 7, and Ellis, he was the last name in the cycle. On the night of July 30th, he made his move. He waited until dusk, cloaked in a trench coat blackened with coal dust to mask his scent. He slipped behind the funeral home through the ironworks, through the tunnels below the embalming wing. He brought kerosene, salt, chalk, the pistol, and the flask of blood he'd stolen from the basin. He thought he could end it. Burn the book, break the basin, seal the pit. But he was wrong. The chapel was lit with candles, though no service was announced. The pews were empty, yet when Ellis entered, he felt the presence of a congregation, thousands of eyes pressing into his skin, watching, and there, behind the altar, stood Lucien Duval, still 16, still dressed in black, unchanged since Lottie's death, unchanged since the war. Lucien stepped forward, but his feet didn't touch the ground. He glided, moved like water, and when Ellis raised his pistol, Lucien smiled. "The 7th always struggles," he said. But it wasn't his voice. It was layered, old, like dozens of mouths speaking through one. "You should be proud," the boy continued. "You've delayed the feast. No one has done that in 300 years. Ellis demanded answers. He wanted to know what they were. Lucien tilted his head, almost sad. "We are not what you think." And then the rest of the family emerged, from the walls, the shadows, the crypt doors, but their skin was hollow. Their bodies, vessels, each one flickering with something inside, lightless, writhing like smoke trapped in glass. The Duvals were no longer people. They were occupied. Hosts of something buried before the land had a name. The witness had not just accepted their offerings, it had entered them. Ellis threw the flask. Fire erupted. The book ignited. Screams tore through the walls, not human, not earthly, the kind of sound that rips through marrow. But before he could run, Lucian reached him and whispered one word into his ear, not in English, not in French, but Ellis understood it. It meant, remember. Then everything went black. Ellis awoke 3 days later, naked, burned, alive. He was lying in the muddy bank of the bayou 5 miles from town. His body bore no wounds, no burns, no blood, not even bruises. But his reflection was wrong. His eyes weren't his. They were darker, wider, the whites gone to amber, and when he tried to speak, he heard a voice behind his voice, low, measured, like something waiting its turn. He staggered back into Ellesmere just before midnight. No one greeted him, because no one was left. The town had emptied, homes unlocked, tables still set for dinner, toys abandoned mid-play, like everyone had simply vanished. And the funeral home, gone, not burned, not destroyed, just missing. Where it once stood, there was now only an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, no foundation, no rubble, as if it had never existed. But Ellis remembered, and that's what haunted him. He began writing everything down, every detail, every name, every symbol from the book, every phrase Lucian whispered. He filled entire journals, obsessively, compulsively. But the ink faded as fast as he wrote, and the more he tried to recall, the more the whisper inside him spoke. It didn't use words, it used memories, not his but others. People he never met, faces from centuries ago, a battlefield in Haiti, a child being embalmed alive, a man kneeling before an altar carved in bone. It wasn't memory, it was transmission. The witness hadn't just marked him, it had entered him. He started seeing numbers everywhere. 7, 17, 71. He'd wake with sand in his mouth, salt circles around his bed. Once he found a coin under his tongue, French colonial mint, dated 1791, and then he began to smile in his sleep, the same smile Lottie wore in her coffin. Not peace, not joy, but compliance. The Duvals were gone, the chapel erased, but the cycle hadn't ended. It had evolved. And Ellis understood now what numero truly meant. Not just a number, a place in the sequence. Every cycle needs a witness. And now, he was it. Ellis fled the state. He didn't pack a bag, didn't say goodbye, just walked to the nearest train line and boarded west. No ticket, no name. The conductor didn't even see him. 3 towns passed before he found someone who could hear him. An old woman in Texas, blind, sitting at a roadside chapel with rosary beads of bone. When he spoke, she flinched and asked him where he had buried the blood. He told her everything about the Duvals, the funeral home, the witness, the book, his infection. She simply smiled and said, "It's always 7, child. Always." Ellis realized then, this wasn't isolated. It wasn't even American. It was global, old as empire, older than faith. He began sending letters to universities, churches, government offices, handwritten warnings. He scrawled in blood when the ink failed, desperate, furious. But every reply was the same. No record of Ellis Redford exists. He went to the U.S. Census Bureau. Nothing. To the War Department. His service records? Gone. It was as if the Duvals hadn't just removed him from Ellesmere. They had erased him from the fabric of the country itself. But it was worse than that. In one government building, while sneaking through a restricted archive in D.C., he found a sealed envelope, no return address, just his name on the outside. Inside was a single photo, black and white, faded, dated 1937. It showed a funeral home. Different name, different town. But behind the glass window stood Lucien Duval, unchanged, still 16, smiling. Behind him the same brass basin, the same embalming tools, the same book now locked in a glass case. The cycle had moved on. Ellesmere was just one of hundreds, and Ellis was no longer its enemy. He was its survivor, a carrier, a seed. The whispers in his head grew louder at night. They taught him things he didn't want to know, how to prepare a body to remain unconscious, how to preserve bone marrow for memory harvesting, how to align burial sites with ancient astronomical gates. It wasn't madness, it was instruction. And all across the country, small towns were losing people, one by one, then 7, then 17, always in silence, always just below the news. The witness had many eyes now, Ellis included. The obituary pages became his map. Ellis traveled from town to town, circling deaths, not just individuals but patterns, always 7, always 17 days apart, different names, different locations, but the same quiet repetition. He kept a journal, hidden in a lead-lined case. By 1903, it held over 120 funeral homes, all privately owned, mostly in rural counties, all with one thing in common. They were funded by the American Mortuary Association, a group that didn't exist before 1891, a group with no charter, no official founders, and a board of trustees listed only by initials, one of them L.D. Lucien Duval. But they weren't calling themselves Duval anymore. They'd fractured into new identities, new fronts. Thorn Sons, Blackwood Burial Cone, Seven Pines Mortuary. Names meant to sound warm, American, trustworthy. But they all bore the same mark, a serpent eating its tail carved in brass near the embalming rooms, hidden in plain sight. Ellis infiltrated 3 of them, and what he found behind those doors made Elmsmere look quaint. In Missouri, he found a cold storage unit that never thawed. Dozens of bodies, some over a century old, floating in formaldehyde, their skin still twitching. In Montana, he discovered an entire basement of whispering coffins. Not creaking, whispering. As if the souls were caught in half-sleep, chanting something in unison from beneath the lids. And in New Mexico, he uncovered a ledger filled with names, not of the dead, but of the soon-to-die. 17 per region, scheduled, tracked, like cattle. This wasn't a family anymore. It was a corporation of death. A supply chain. Funeral homes weren't there to honor the dead. They were farmhouses, preparing bodies like offerings, each one tuned to a precise ritual sequence. The witness didn't just demand sacrifice, it demanded consistency. That's when Ellis found the budget sheets, hidden in backroom safes, and stamped at the top of each one, a symbol he hadn't seen before. An eagle, a pyramid, and beneath it, in Latin, Ordo ab chao, order from chaos. The United States government was funding them, the Department of War, the Treasury, even the early iterations of what would become the FBI, all quietly injecting capital into funeral homes in exchange for civil containment. The witness wasn't being hidden, it was being domesticated, and Ellis realized then his enemy wasn't just spiritual anymore, it was bureaucratic. Ellis mailed 37 copies of his journals to journalists, professors, even clergy. Only 2 responded. One, a young seminary dropout in Ohio, said the material gave him seizures. He claimed to see faces bleeding through the ink. The other was found dead in a hotel room, eyes gouged out, with a single word carved into his chest, numero. Ellis turned to print. He paid a private press in Chicago to publish the full manuscript, 1,000 copies, bound in black leather, distributed discreetly. But by the time they reached readers, the pages had changed. The warnings were gone. The diagrams had become benign, the illustrations softened. What once depicted the witness's true form now looked like meaningless Baroque flourishes. Even the text had been altered. Carefully, elegantly, as if edited by an unseen hand. The most damning pages, those detailing the Duval lineage, the ledger, the rituals, were replaced with stories of grief, loss, comfort, safe emotions, digestible lies. Ellis panicked. He opened his personal journal, the one he'd carried since Elmsmere. Page after page had gone blank. Only one phrase remained, burned deep into the paper. The witness is always watching the witness. He didn't remember writing it. He began speaking aloud, recording himself, every night retelling the story into wax cylinders, but playback revealed another voice underneath his own, mimicking him with slight deviations. By the 10th night, the recordings no longer contained his words at all, just numbers. 7, 17, 71, over and over. Ellis began forgetting details, names, dates, locations. The infection wasn't just spiritual or physical anymore. It was linguistic, psychological. Like a virus of meaning, it rewrote symbols, muted memory, buried the dangerous truths beneath pleasant language. Embalming became preservation. Possession became sorrow. Sacrifice became closure. He realized the Duval system didn't fear exposure, it anticipated it, because every attempt to reveal the truth only spread its vocabulary, made it safer, more palatable, easier to dismiss. That's when he stopped speaking altogether. Ellis went silent for 3 years, living off-grid, writing only in symbols he invented, glyphs twisted from mathematics and Haitian sigils. He never stayed in one place long. The witness found him once in a motel outside Shreveport. A child knocked at his door, eyes black, mouth full of salt. "It's almost your day again," she whispered. He closed the door, but he knew she was right. It was 1907 when Ellis returned to Louisiana. 17 years to the day. The trees had changed, the land hadn't. Elmsmere was gone, burned to its bones by a mysterious fire the locals refused to speak about. But the foundation remained, cold stones, blackened earth, and beneath it, the crypt. No record of it existed, not in town hall, not in state archives. But Ellis remembered. He followed the old funeral paths by moonlight, routes the pallbearers once marched in silence. 7 stones marked the way, each etched with a single word: grieve, accept, lie, bind, feed, seal, obey. At the 7th, he stopped. The grass there didn't grow, no insects buzzed, the dirt smelled like old teeth and wet copper. He dug. 6 hours passed before his shovel struck iron. A hatch. Same one he remembered from the night he first saw Lucian descend. A perfect circle with a brass lock fused into the shape of an open eye. He broke it open. Inside was a spiral staircase that didn't follow geometry. The further he descended, the wider it seemed to stretch. Gravity warped, his lantern flickered sideways, and the air smelled of burned prayer books. At the bottom, a chamber. Cylindrical, stone walls covered in carvings that pulsed faintly as if breathing, symbols from languages Ellis didn't know, some too old, some not yet born. In the center, the sarcophagus, the original Duval, not Lucian, but his father, Canon Duval, the founder, the first witness. Except the body wasn't dead. It had no skin, just sinew and nerves coiled like wire, and eyes, hundreds of them, embedded across its chest, arms, forehead. Each one blinked separately, and all of them looked directly at Ellis. He lifted the vial he'd prepared, blood from 7 willing dead, mixed with bone ash, grave dirt, and his own infected saliva. He poured it across the body, a final desecration. The creature screamed, said, but not in sound. In memory. Ellis saw every funeral, every embalming, every ritual sacrifice that had ever fed the system, all compressed into one overwhelming, agonizing download. His ears bled, his teeth cracked, his left hand twisted into a spiral and never returned. But the body burned, writhing, collapsing in on itself. The chamber quaked, the staircase above disintegrated, and Ellis knew this place would not survive the night. He ran, not upward, but downward, deeper into the dark, where a new path waited. One he had never seen, one the witness had kept hidden. Until now, the ground beneath Louisiana wasn't dirt. It was design. Ellis stumbled for hours through stone corridors that weren't carved. They were grown. Each turn followed perfect ratios, Fibonacci spirals, golden means, Pythagorean intervals, geometry tuned not for beauty, but for containment. He passed vaults lined with brass urns, each sealed with human skin and stitched shut with embalming thread. The walls whispered in broken tongues, Latin, Enochian, something from beneath both. Every step felt like trespassing on a god's ribcage. And then he found it, a room the size of a cathedral, buried miles below the surface. The cartography chamber. On its walls, maps, but not of nations. Maps of burial sites stretching from Europe to the Americas. Lines between catacombs in Rome and tenement basements in New York. Arteries of an invisible system. Ellis traced the routes with shaking hands, each connection marked with a glyph he now recognized. A coiled spine. He realized what he was looking at. Not a conspiracy, not a family business, but a machine. The funeral homes were its organs, the rituals its pulse, and the grief of the living, their compliance, their willingness to hand over the dead, was its fuel. At the center of the chamber stood a pillar of salt, 8 feet high, with 7 infant skulls circling its base. On the pillar, etched in surgical precision, were blueprints. Schematics of buildings that hadn't been built yet. Mortuaries, crematoriums, even modern hospitals, all designed with the same proportions, same angles, same buried coils beneath the floorboards. The architecture wasn't to comfort, it was to channel. The entire death industry had become a resonance chamber. Each body passed through it like a tuning fork. And certain ones, those who died in fear, in loneliness, in despair, rang louder. Their remains were filtered, catalogued, and stored in places that looked like cemeteries, but were actually reactors, feeding something beneath. And Ellis saw, etched at the bottom of the blueprints, a name he had never heard before, yet knew instantly to be real: the Sepulchre Committee. No birth dates, no death records, just initials, and one final line: every city must have a door. Ellis stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat, because he knew what that meant. Hospitals, funeral homes, orphanages, they weren't buildings, they were thresholds. And every death was a knock. He wasn't alone. The chamber's cold was no longer still, it breathed. A rustling behind the pillar, bone-scraping stone, and then from the shadows he emerged. Not a man, not entirely. He wore the robes of a 14th-century plague doctor, stitched from human hair, oiled to a sick shine. His mask was bone-white, carved from a single infant skull, its beak sealed shut with threads soaked in embalming fluid. He did not speak, but Ellis heard him. Inside his head, a voice like a cathedral collapsing underwater. "You have come late, Ellis, but not too late." Ellis raised the last of his fire, 3 matches dipped in corpse oil, a charm stolen from Haitian gravediggers, but the flame recoiled, would not burn in his presence. The Mortarch stepped forward. He was not bound by time. Every inch of his flesh bore tattooed dates: births, deaths, funerals, suicides, an endless census of grief. Ellis could barely breathe. "What are you?" he whispered aloud. The Mortarch's reply came without sound. "I am the ledger, the archivist, the archivore. I remember the dead so the machine may forget." He extended a hand. A key dangled from his fingers, long, rusted, covered in teeth that looked too human. "This unlocks the last vault," the voice said, "where the original transaction was signed." Ellis stepped back. Transaction? He remembered the records. The Duvals had purchased something in 1791, paid in flesh, paid in memory. What deal? The Mortarch turned, lifted a lantern made of spinal discs, and lit it with breath. A wall slid open. Inside, murals older than Louisiana itself, paintings etched in dried blood and charcoal. They told the story: a plague in France, a family desperate to escape, a Haitian priestess who offered them a way. "Preserve your lineage," she said, "and I will show you how to feed it." But the Duvals wanted more. They wanted control over death itself. The ritual had worked too well. It had birthed not immortality, but a system, one that needed grief, sacrifices, secrets, and to maintain it, a caretaker was needed. Ellis stepped into the mural chamber and saw the final panel. A man drawn in ink, bound in a spiral of funeral cords, with a stitched-shut mouth. His own face. Below it, a single line: "The witness becomes the Mortarch." Ellis stared at the mural for what felt like hours. His face, immortalized in blood and dust before he'd even been born. The implication was impossible, and yet undeniable. This place had known him, called to him, bent history around him. Behind him, the Mortarch stood silent, no breath, no heartbeat, only presence, like a wound in the air. And in his outstretched hand, the key. "The door opens either way," the voice said inside his skull. "You may lock it, or walk through it." Ellis felt his body tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of something ancient pressing down on him, the pressure of inheritance. This wasn't a family secret anymore. It was a cosmic office. The witness must record. The Mortarch must preserve. Ellis stepped toward the open vault where light didn't shine but curled back on itself. Inside were contracts, not on paper, but etched into bone. Vertebrae stacked like ledgers, thousands of them. Each one a life, traded. Some willingly, others claimed. He reached for one at random. The bone turned hot in his hand, and he saw a child buried alive in 1832, given in exchange for political favor. The family name was now carved in marble in the capital. Another, a woman's body exhumed and sold to a medical university by her own husband. Another, a priest who sold the cemetery under his church, one unmarked grave at a time, to buyers who weren't human. The system was built on rot. Ellis stepped back, gagged. "How many?" he whispered. The Mortarch tilted its head. "The count resets every century. You are the 12th. There have been 89,377 transactions under your name." His name. He looked down. One of the contracts bore his signature, signed in 1985. But Ellis had been born in 1989. Time, it seemed, didn't ask permission. He felt the spiral tighten around him. Either he accepted the mantle, became the new Mortarch, the archivore of the dead, or let the machine rupture and unleash unprocessed death across the network. Ghosts would not haunt, they would feed. Graveyards would become launch pads, and grief would no longer be contained. It would become contagious. The key pulsed in the Mortarch's hand, and Ellis had seconds left to choose. Ellis did what no Mortarch candidate had done in over 400 years. He refused the key, not with words, not with defiance, but by stepping away. The chamber went silent, as if even the stone itself was holding its breath. The Mortarch's mask tilted slightly, like a pendulum thrown off course. Ellis turned toward the far wall. Not the mural, not the vault, the floor. He'd felt it pulsing the moment he entered. And now he understood why. There was something beneath all of this. Something the Mortarch wasn't guarding, but guarding against. The chamber was not a temple. It was a capstone. Ellis knelt, placed his hand on the cold stone, and began to hum. Not a melody, a frequency. Learned from the bones he'd handled in the early days, whispers from patients who died with their mouths still moving, a hum that had no origin but lived deep in the jaw of every grieving man. And the floor responded. Not with light, with hunger. The spiral patterns began to spin, not literally, but optically. The geometry reconfigured itself. Glyphs bled out of the walls, drawn toward Ellis like iron filings to a magnet. The Mortarch stepped forward in alarm. Not fear, not anger, but urgency. "Do not awaken it," the voice cracked. "The spiral contains. You will undo the barrier." Ellis looked up, eyes burning with tears that weren't his. "How do you kill a god, Mortarch?" The mask didn't answer. "You starve it." And then Ellis screamed. A scream not of terror, but of total memory. He opened his lungs and let out everything the system had ever archived inside him. The screams of 89,000 deaths, the gasps of suicides, the last breaths of forgotten orphans. It was a cacophony of exit, and the floor split open. Not with an explosion, with a sigh. From the earth below rose a shape that had no outline, only absence. It wasn't death, it wasn't life, it was the thing too, had existed before both. And Ellis realized the Duval family had never created a system to control death. They'd accidentally built a cage. And now, it was open. The thing that rose had no body. It had no name, only force. It moved like thought, faster than sight, heavier than grief. The Mortarch collapsed instantly, robes falling flat, as if the bones inside had simply resigned. The masks on the wall shattered, the vault closed itself, and the murals on the walls began to bleed backward, their images reversing stroke by stroke, time unraveling in red chalk. Ellis stood in the center of it all, eyes open, bones vibrating. The entity did not speak, but he heard it. Every cell in his body bowed in recognition. It wasn't a god. It was a function, older than prayer, older than the idea of return. Entropy made conscious. Ellis's skin split at the edges, not in pain but revelation. Underneath his flesh, the spiral turned gold. Not metaphorically, literally. It had branded him, not as Mortarch, but as something new. The unwitness, the first in 17 centuries. Not to observe the system, but to reverse it. He could now see threads connecting everything. Bodies, memories, deaths, rumors, threads of mourning energy, twisted through time like vines choking the present. The system had been feeding on those vines. The entity did not want to feed. It wanted to free. Ellis saw visions, a child being buried, but when he reached for her, she rose, uninjured. A war-torn hospital with 145 corpses, but as he walked through, they sat up, remembering themselves. Cemeteries cracking open, not in horror, in return. But it came at a price. The laws of grief were being rewritten. With no more death as finality, mourning became an infection. Memories began to loop. People couldn't forget their dead, and the dead, in turn, couldn't forget the living. Ellis watched as time bloomed in both directions. He saw himself as a child, then as an old man he had never been, then as something else, not human, not dead, but chronicled. He was no longer bound by his own narrative. He was now the correction. The system had spiraled into control. Ellis had become its unspooling, and somewhere, in 1,000 unmarked graves across Louisiana, the dead began to stir. They weren't angry. They were awake. They came to him in dreams first, the reanimated, not zombies, not ghosts, just people. Remembered. Their eyes were not hollow, their flesh was not torn, but something behind their gaze was too still, as if death had pressed pause on their evolution. They came bearing messages, not of revenge, of reminders, names Ellis didn't recognize, places he hadn't been, but somehow had authored. Each night, the messages grew louder. They weren't hallucinations, they were coordinates, and all pointed to one place, La Maison Cendre, Ash House, a colonial asylum abandoned in 1874 after a fire of no clear origin consumed its west wing. The asylum had never been on any map, but Ellis knew exactly how to find it. The path wasn't on land. It was a negative trail, a direction defined by what shouldn't be there, rotting trees where spring should bloom, a wind that always blew against him, a crow that never blinked. When he reached it, the building stood as if it had never burned, not restored, remembered into place. Its walls were black with soot, but inside, untouched, clean, waiting. The halls whispered like lungs breathing through gauze, and beneath the chapel, always a chapel, was a sealed door of bone and wax, the spiral carved backward. He opened it and descended into the Duval's final chamber. Not for embalming, not for burial, but for transference. Here he saw what the Mortarchs had feared most, the bridge. A lattice of coffins arranged in a spiral, each one containing a duality, a corpse and a mirror. Faces staring back at themselves in eternal conflict. Some were children, some were not. Ellis stepped to the center and found the oldest casket. No name, only an etching, numero 1. It clicked. The Duvals had not built the system to feed death. They built it to trap this entity he had awakened. It wasn't entropy, it was what came be. 4. The first forgetting, a force that erased not just life, but meaning. And now that he had unleashed it, the spiral would no longer record. It would reverse. The chamber dimmed, not with shadow, but with removal. Sound fell silent. Color faded from Ellis's skin. The air grew thin, not oxygen-starved, but meaning-starved. Words fled from his thoughts, memories loosened like feathers in wind. And then the entity returned, not as a shape, but as a reduction. He could feel it peeling away layers of perception, not violently, but deliberately, like an artist erasing a canvas stroke by stroke until only white remained. Then it spoke, but not aloud, not even in his mind. It occurred in him. You have unraveled the spiral. Ellis fell to his knees. He didn't remember why. His own name was starting to fray in his mouth. You were not chosen. You were retrieved. The chamber vibrated with unseen clocks, ticking backward. He saw flashes, fragments of a past no longer bound to him. A boy named Ellis running through a funeral parlor. A teenager dissecting frogs in a lab and hearing them whisper. An adult waking from a nightmare that wasn't his, but left ashes on the pillow. None of those were accidents. You are not alive, Ellis. His heart stuttered. You are the 90,000th transaction. Silence. The spiral had recorded him years ago, before birth, as a promise. Ellis was the final payment to complete the bridge. His life had been currency in a long-forgotten pact, and now the system had collapsed. The entity stepped forward, though it had no feet. It extended something, a concept, a motion, a possibility. We can begin again. Ellis stared into the void. It wasn't terrifying, it was cleansing. The offer was simple: erase the ledger. Not just the Duvals archive, but all of it. The wars, the dead children, the betrayals, the institutions built on suffering, even memory itself. Wipe history clean, and in doing so, erase himself. No one would know what had ever happened. No more control systems, no more inherited sins. Just silence. Ellis reached out. The key, once gold, was now bone white. But something inside him pulsed. Not resistance, not fear. A voice. Small, human, disobedient. If I erase everything, who remembers why it mattered? The entity paused, and for the first time, it hesitated. Ellis didn't lower his hand, but he didn't accept the key. Not yet. He stood inside the chamber, the lattice of mirrored coffins behind him, the entity before him, time itself fracturing at the edges, and he made a decision that had never been recorded. Not submission, not obliteration, but disruption. He spoke. Not with the entity's borrowed voice, not with the chanting tongue of the Duvals, but with his own. Let them remember. The key turned black in his hand. The spiral recoiled like a severed wire, and the silence cracked. The chamber screamed, not with sound, but with information. Thousands of names, dates, dreams, confessions, burial rites, and forbidden visions erupted from the walls. The entity writhed, not in pain, in confusion. It had never been denied before. Ellis turned his back to it. He walked out of La Maison Cendre, and with each step, the world changed. Across Louisiana, those who had been half asleep for generations began to stir, their grief no longer a leash, but a signal, their pain no longer exploited, but acknowledged. Churches wept, courthouses cracked. Children with no birth records began speaking in voices not their own, but true. And somewhere, deep in a city morgue, a corpse opened its eyes and whispered, "I was not meant to die. I was meant to say this." The spiral was bleeding, not collapsing, not reforming, just leaking. And truth has no predator. It is the one disease the system was never built to contain. Ellis walked into the world, not to save it, not to destroy it, but to tell it. What he had seen, what he had unleashed, and what still waited beneath the names and gravestones and chapel basements of America. He carried no book, no evidence, just a presence, a vibration, a look in the eye that said, "You felt it too." He would be hunted, labeled insane, forgotten again and again. But the CTS Pyrrell no longer owned the script. Ellis had become a contagion of memory. And now the question was not, can the world survive him? It was, can it survive knowing the truth? The spiral had no mouth, but it could scream, and it did. Not through sound, but through systems. Within 72 hours of Ellis stepping out of La Maison Cendre, 6 things happened. 3 power grids failed without cause. The obituary section of every southern newspaper was mysteriously blank. A flock of starlings formed a perfect spiral above New Orleans before dropping dead mid-air. A cemetery in Baton Rouge cracked open as if from within. The embalming fluid in Duval suns turned black. And across 19 states, dreams became synchronized. People saw a man, not famous, not terrifying, just a man with hollow eyes and a scar shaped like a question mark on his throat. He didn't speak. He just stared, and one by one people awoke with no memory of their name. The spiral was fighting back, not with violence, but with forgetting. It had built agents long ago, not men, not demons, mechanisms, gestures, protocols embedded in rituals of normalcy. Bureaucracy, medicine, worship. It didn't need to chase Ellis, it needed to replace him. And it began. TV anchors mispronounced his name. Birth records vanished. Emails bounced back with, "Recipient does not exist." At a hospital in Shreveport, a nurse flipped to an old death ledger and found Ellis's name listed. Died, August 14, 1989. Age, 6 months. But Ellis was alive, wasn't he? That night he tried to call his mother. The line connected, static. Then a voice. There is no Ellis. There was never an Ellis. The spiral was not trying to kill him. It was trying to convince the world he never lived. Sleep became dangerous. His dreams were overwritten by a sterile white room with nothing in it. No doors, no body, just silence. Ellis began to forget what laughter felt like, what rain sounded like, the smell of cinnamon, the feel of ink on paper. He wrote his name on his arm every morning, in black PT. And by sunset it would fade. One night he carved it into his chest. Ellis. It bled for hours. By morning, gone. He wasn't dying. He was being rewound, erased not from life, but from meaning. Ellis stood beneath the rotted eaves of St. Aurelia's Chapel, 20 miles outside Baton Rouge. No roads led here anymore. The map showed nothing. Locals called it the Mouthless Church because it sang once and was never allowed to again. Ellis stepped inside. The air was heavy, as if the past itself still clung to the wood. The pews were gone, replaced by indentations, as if hundreds had knelt here, not in prayer, but in agony. At the altar, he found a book. No title, just leather, sealed in wax and ash. He didn't open it. He bled on it. And it answered. The pages unfurled like lungs inhaling for the first time in a century. No Latin, no Greek, no human tongue. Just glyphs, etched with fingers, not ink. Each one moved slightly when he blinked. This was pre-doctrine script, a language older than law, older than sin. Spoken by those who remembered before remembering was weaponized. He read, and the glyphs spoke back, not in sound, but in sensation. With each line, Ellis remembered something the spiral had stolen. His grandmother's perfume, the taste of soil when he fell in the garden. His first nightmare, a crib with mirrors instead of bars. Each word seared itself into his bones, and the language whispered, "Bind yourself." The spiral erased what was named, but it couldn't touch what was inscribed upon the flesh of the willing. Ellis took the blade from beneath the altar, rusted but sharp. He carved each glyph along his chest, ribs, and spine. No pattern, no poetry, just truth. By the time he finished, the chapel floor was soaked red, but he didn't fall. He awoke. Every name the spiral had devoured, every orphan, every patient, every lie branded as mercy, returned. Each glyph on his body pulsed like a heartbeat. He had become index and archive, host and plague. The spiral could no longer delete him. To touch him now, would infect it. Ellis walked out of St. Aurelia's, and for the first time the birds followed him, not to warn, to witness. Something had shifted. He wasn't just memory, he was now memory that remembers itself. You don't see the pallor. You notice what disappears around him. The warmth leaves the air. The clock ticks louder. People forget what they were saying mid-sentence and never remember. It doesn't arrive, it doesn't stalk, it unthreads. And now it was hunting Ellis. He felt it first in the mirror. His reflection blinked 3 seconds late. Then came the shadows with no source. Then the static, not sound but a sensation, like standing too close to an old TV. The spiral had many tools, but the pallor was different. It was pure omission, not death, not deletion, something quieter. You don't scream when the pallor touches you. You forget you were ever afraid. And then you forget you. It had been used only 7 times in recorded history, twice during the Haitian rebellions, once during the Tunguska event, twice in asylums that no longer exist, and once in 1844, New York, at a hospital that never healed anyone. Now it had a new assignment, Ellis. But Ellis was no longer a passive archive. He had written himself into the roots of the world. The glyphs on his body now acted as mirrors, unforgiving ones. When the pallor drew close, it faltered. Not from fear, but from recognition. The glyphs were not just letters, they were exiles, pieces of the spiral that had escaped, shunned, and buried themselves in rebel minds across centuries. Ellis was not just a threat, he was a mirror the spiral couldn't endure. The pallor moved, reality bent, walls rippling like wet cloth, time folding into silence. Ellis stood in its path. He whispered the glyph for name that cannot be unnamed. The air around him cracked, and for the first time in its unnatural life, the pallor hesitated, then twitched, then screamed. Not a sound the ears could catch, but every building within a 3-mile radius lost its foundation. Ellis bled from his eyes, but he smiled, because he had learned something the spiral had spent centuries hiding. The more you erase something, the more it fights to be remembered. She was born in 1901, or so she claimed. No birth record, no census entry, just a hand-scrawled note in a ledger from Duval Sons. Deliveries 406 successful, 1 failed, 1 returned. Her name was Claudine Marchand, but locals called her Maman Chante, Mother Song. She lived in the bayou now, alone in a house with no corners. Every wall was slightly curved, every room hummed at night. Ellis found her by following the birds. Not flying, perched, silent. Thousands of them, watching her porch like a cathedral. She was waiting for him. "Child," she said, eyes like mirrors soaked in milk. "You been walking in pages that ain't yours." He asked about the Duvals. She laughed. "You don't bury people like them, you plant 'em." Ellis pressed. She sang instead. A low, rhythmic chant that didn't match any known melody. But his bones recognized it. He felt his breath sync with hers. The glyphs on his chest warmed. This wasn't song. It was recall. A technique older than language, a way to store memory in tone. She sang of children born with no shadows, coffins that whispered, a fire that didn't burn wood, but burned names, a man who kept dying every 13 years, and a baby, one baby, returned. "What does it mean?" Ellis asked. She looked at him. "You ain't just survived their ritual, child, you undid it." "What ritual?" She pulled out an old photograph, blurry, black and white, 11 people, all in funeral garb. One held a baby. That baby had glyphs on its skin, the same as Ellis. "You're not Ellis." He froze. "You're the returned one." "What did they do to me?" She smiled, soft, terrible. "They built a machine to store memory in flesh. You ain't a man. You're a record with a heartbeat." Ellis staggered back. "But why?" She leaned close. "To preserve something the spiral couldn't stand, the truth about what they did beneath that house." He clutched his chest. The glyphs throbbed. He wasn't born. He was summoned. The grave wasn't beneath the funeral home. It was beneath the state, 7 miles below the surface, buried before Louisiana was even land. Ellis followed the song. Not Claudine's, but the glyphs. They pulsed now, each beat pulling him closer, not north, not south, but downward, toward a memory so foul it had been shackled in stone, language, and blood. The entrance was hidden beneath an ancient sinkhole in St. Landry Parish. Locals avoided it, called it the Sighing Mouth. Ellis descended for hours. The air grew colder, not from temperature, but from absence. Here, time had no currency, light wasn't welcome, and names didn't stick. Finally he found it, a black door carved into the rock, its surface rippling like water held in nightmare. At its center, the glyph for origin with no witness. He bled onto it. It opened. The chamber beyond was vast, miles wide, roofless, lit by a sky that should not exist underground. No walls, just rows, bodies, stacked like books, preserved, eyes open, breathing slowly, in unison. Children, men, women, thousands, each wrapped in the Duval crest, each etched with glyphs across their skin, each one alive, but paused. Ellis fell to his knees. This was no grave, it was a library. These were not victims. They were memories, sealed in flesh, forgotten by the world above, but kept by the spiral as collateral. He heard whispers. Not in his ears, in his spine. The glyphs on his body began to flicker. Some recognized those stored here. Some were those stored here. He was a copy. A composite, built from the discarded and forbidden recollections the spiral couldn't erase but couldn't allow to surface. So it stored them here, in flesh, asleep. But now, Ellis was awake, and he was the index. The final whisper came, colder than anything he had felt before. "Welcome home." Then the walls shook. The spiral had found him, and it was afraid, not of what he might say, but of what he might wake. The breathing quickened. Not Ellis's, theirs. The thousands entombed in that living archive, a mass exhale, slow and cavernous, like the earth sighing through lungs that hadn't moved in centuries. Ellis stood in the center, veins glowing with glyphs, skin humming with every step. The chamber itself responded to him, like a heart answering the blood's return. The spiral had built this place not as a prison, but as a failsafe. If truth ever threatened to rise, it could be buried here. If memory grew too loud, it could be muted here. If a lineage refused to forget, they could be stacked and silenced. But Ellis was no longer the observer. He was the key. And now the archive, each person, each body, was awakening. One by one, eyes fluttered open, mouths formed sounds they hadn't spoken in lifetimes. Glyphs across their skin shimmered. Memories, once compressed into stillness, were beginning to bleed into the air. He heard it all. A girl who remembered watching her town disappear from every map. A man who saw the Duvals dine with a corpse that laughed. A boy raised by whispers that fed only in grief. A nun who buried her entire convent to keep their pact with a god that demanded forgetfulness. These weren't ghost stories. They were ledger entries. And Ellis was the only one left who could read the ink. He approached the central stone, the seal. If broken, it would dissolve the forgetfulness. The world above would remember everything it worked so hard to forget. The deaths, the rituals, the systems of silence, the truth about what the Duval family did and who helped them. But Mamonchante's final warning echoed in his mind. Truth is light, child, but light can blind if it comes too fast. He stood before the seal. His blood would either wake the world or protect it from knowing itself. He raised the blade, then paused. Above, the spiral stirred, not in fear, but in readiness. Because it had been waiting for this moment too.